Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast my friend Benny Peiser. He is the head of Net Zero Watch in Britain. Benny, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for having me again.
So, Benny, I'm going to have you introduce yourself briefly. I know there's a lot to talk about what's happening in Britain, and particularly with Liz Truss's resignation. But if you don't mind, please introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, so I'm the director of Net Zero Watch, which is a think tank concerned about the costs and implications of climate energy policies in Britain and around the world. And we monitor very carefully developments and, have a lot of energy economists and analysts commenting on developments.
And you publish a newsletter, which you can sign up for at netzerowatch.com. But Benny, I wanted to have you on. Today's October 22nd because of the recent developments in Britain, which are really remarkable and very sobering. The Prime Minister Liz Truss has resigned. Give us an update on what's going on in Britain and what's the seriousness of the energy situation in Britain today.
Right. So the political class in Britain is in deep trouble, particularly the Conservative government, which has been ruling this country roughly for 12 years, during which time they have managed to cause a huge energy disaster by blowing up coal-fired power plants and phasing down nuclear power, and essentially going primarily for renewable energy, which, as we know, requires a lot of backup, which is essentially natural gas. So we are very reliant on natural gas because of the renewables mainly, and because we have shut down most of our nuclear and power, nuclear and coal. And so as the gas price has gone through the roof, we are paying the price for these completely failed policies. In the past, whenever we had high gas prices, countries would simply shift to coal. That is no longer possible because coal has been essentially shut down. So there is simply no alternative.
Well, so what triggered Truss's resignation? I mean, she's now the shortest serving prime minister in British history. She comes into power just after Boris Johnson was essentially tossed out in a no confidence, what looked like a no confidence measure. But how important was explain to the people listening what happened with the Labour Party bill that was in Parliament, how they introduced, as I understand it, and you wrote about this, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. You put out a news piece or an email on Net Zero Watch on Thursday talking about this. But what did Labour do, and why did they do it?
Okay, these are two different issues.
Okay.
First is, why did Liz Truss why did she essentially had to resign? Liz Truss and her new government completely messed up in their so-called mini budget, where they announced tax cuts, but, and this is the big but, which spooked the markets, while they announced tax cuts, they also announced a 60 billion handout to every single household and every single business in the country to keep the energy prices not from skyrocketing. So what you cannot do is cut taxes on the one hand and then hand out tens of billions on the other hand. That doesn't work. That spooked the markets. The pound crashed essentially, and the markets punished this new government, and the rest is history. So what is happening is the ministers haven't got a clue what is causing the current economic and energy crisis. They don't understand it, and so therefore they don't understand how to rectify or intervene to minimize the damage. And because they are swimming, they are sinking.
Well, so then you said there are two different issues. Okay, so I think that's a good explanation. I like how you frame that. And it is remarkable to hear that the British pound has been at close to parity to the US dollar. which there are a lot of things we can talk about currency valuation, but then talk about labor. Why would labor, as I read it, tell me if I've got this correct. Labor, the Labour Party, which as you say has been out of power now for a dozen years, introduce a bill in Parliament that forces a vote on the issue of hydraulic fracturing. One of the first things Truss did when she got to 10 Downing was to lift the ban on hydraulic fracturing. But Labor introduces a bill to say, oh, no, we want to ban hydraulic fracturing.
Very
let me just add, what the hell? I mean, amidst this, Labor would do what might make this move. Why?
They're very shrewd. They're very shrewd. First of all, Labor also, just like the Conservatives, believes that the whole country can be powered by renewables, and they think that could be done within the next 8 years. Believe it or not, that's what they're saying. But they're very shrewd. Why did they table this motion? Primarily because the Conservative Parliamentary Party is split. There's a very strong Green wing within the Conservative Party who announced that they will work with Labour to kill fracking. They said that quite openly. So the Green Tories, the Green Conservatives, have worked with Labour to kill fracking, and they've managed. No one is going to invest in Britain. No company is going to start fracking. So this is basically being killed off for years to come.
The possibility of hydraulic fracturing is being killed off for years to come.
Yeah, because no one in their right mind is going to invest in Britain under these circumstances. I mean, if you're a company wanting to get shale gas out of the ground, would you invest in Britain? Of course you wouldn't, knowing that the majority of Parliament is against it. So there's no chance.
Well, this
and
is very
the irony is, of course, is the reason why we have these, astronomical gas prices is because we haven't got enough supply. So the logical conclusion would be get some more out of the ground. No, that's why I'm saying our political elite hasn't got a clue what is causing the economic and energy crisis, and therefore it will get much, much worse in years to come. It will get worse rather than better.
Oh, man, this is just hard to hear because, the Financial Times just reported the other day that Britain now has the highest electricity prices in all of Europe. That used to be a distinction held by Germany, but now it's Britain. But let's go back to that because I think that point about hydraulic fracturing is key. I just looked up these numbers. So in 2000, Britain was producing about 10 billion cubic feet per day of gas, domestic production. Today, it's 3.1 BCF, or it was in 2021. So now, and you're using 7.5 or 7.4 BCF. So now you're importing a majority of your natural gas, and your existing production is declining and declining very rapidly. And so the situation is really quite dire. And let me ask this question because it's one that I've heard from different people about. Do you have any good estimates on if their hydraulic fracturing is allowed and Britain has substantial shale gas resources, billions or trillions of cubic feet potential, how long could it take for them to start producing significant quantities of gas? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, my understanding is that if the conditions were right and the government were to give the green light and wouldn't put all these kind of conditions and regulatory hurdles and so on, you could do it within 12 months, essentially. You
could start drilling. You could start drilling, but the production could be another year after that or so, or that's a pretty aggressive time frame.
Well, it is. And as I said, it would require the right conditions. But
sure.
From a purely technical point of view, my understanding is that had the government given the green light right away without any of these regulatory hurdles and local vetoes and so on, we could have had some initial shale gas out of the ground by next winter, which will, by the way, in all likelihood, will be worse than this winter because now that the gas storage is fairly full around Europe, once we burn this in Europe and the scramble is for new gas, prices will go up because the demand will be very, very high. But the point here is that potentially, no one knows exactly how much shale gas there is because you need to drill and find out.
Right.
But remember, our shale basins in Britain are 10 times deeper than the ones in the US. 10 times. So the average shale basin in the US about 1,000 feet. Here it's 10,000 feet.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know those numbers. That sounds a little shallow for the U.S. basins, but nevertheless, I mean, I know from experience and talking with people in the oil and gas industry that the resources in Britain are sizable. But I want to. So you made this point, and others have made this point that, in fact, that the winter of next winter, not this coming winter, but next winter could be worse. And you're saying that's because the gas resources, the gas reserves or storage will be depleted this winter and then won't be replenished enough for next winter.
It will be replenished, but the gas, most of the gas in the storage today in Europe is Russian gas, right?
So it was bought on the cheap.
Indeed. Next year, there won't be any Russian gas.
So it's going to be.
You will have to buy it from, as I said, the demand for LNG in particular will be very, very high. And so I expect next winter to be even worse than this winter. And that's what a lot of analysts warn.
Right.
I mean, there might be one option, and that is that most of Europe will do what the Germans are doing and just reopening coal-fired power plants.
But you can't do that in Britain because you famously they were dynamited. They were blown up. I mean, and it was celebrated. Oh, we're going to blow these up. And this is, such a great thing because we're moving past coal. And I remember reading the articles in The Guardian saying that celebrating the fact that it was now this is a few years ago, that for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, or the beginning of the electric age, Britain had a full day where it didn't burn any coal for power generation, and
of course.
this was celebrated. Yeah. But now looking back, this seems like the worst possible kind of policy being implemented with no understanding of what the risks were for the future.
Yeah, indeed. And as I said, Britain won't be able to do it because there are no more coal power plants that you can reopen. But many other European countries still have coal power plants or mothballed. They didn't blow them up. They have mothballed them. So they will reopen them like Germany. They'll reopen them. And some countries will build new coal power plants, no doubt. The irony of all of this, of course, is that the eco movement, the green movement, blocking or banning fracking means that Europe will have to rely on more LNG, which is not only much more expensive, but also has a much higher carbon footprint. So, Europe's CO2 emissions will go up quite significantly.
Well, but that Europe will have to rely on more on LNG and coal, though. I mean, you just said that as well, right?
Yeah, indeed.
That is a bitter. I mean, it is and I watched this stunt by these kids. I'm going to say kids because they are kids. These young women who threw tomato soup on the Van Gogh painting, and I was just completely offended. I thought,
they're the ones who are causing all the CO2 emissions, by the way.
What do you mean?
Well, the green movement, the activists who fought against fracking, who fought against nuclear energy, who shut down coal, who shut down nuclear, they're the ones who are driving up CO2 emissions. They are the problem.
That you said
because
that
let's face it, in Britain 25 years ago, there was a clear shift to gas and nuclear. Had we continued with that and never ever touched renewables, we would have less emissions today. We would have lower energy prices than today. We would not have this energy crisis.
So you're putting all this at the feet of the climate activists, that they are the problem, you said.
Well, and our politicians who listened to these teenagers and celebrated them and said, yeah, they are the wise. We will do whatever Greta Thunberg tells us. They know what to do. We will follow them. We will close down nuclear. We'll close down coal. We will incentivize our own gas production. We'll go for Russian gas. They listened to the teenagers, to the activists, and the whole lot. There is no party in the whole of Europe that isn't on this stupid trip, I'm afraid.
Well, so then what happens after Truss? Now, I mean, there have been even rumors, I've seen them in the U.S. press anyway, the possibility that Boris Johnson makes a comeback. I mean, is this even plausible that this would happen?
Look, who would have thought that we are in this deep hole, black hole? Who would have thought anything is possible nowadays?
That Britain looks more like Italy than Italy.
Yeah, without the nice weather and without the good food. Yeah, we are the banana republic without the bananas. No, seriously.
No, it's painful. I'm only laughing because look, I'm not celebrating your misfortune, but I'm just. The whole thing seems so ridiculous that amidst the energy crisis of the biggest energy crisis since World War II, that Labor would pull the move that it did, and that it would effectively contribute to the collapse of this new coalition government in such a short amount of time, indicating the instability of the entire system that has prided itself on stability for decades. I mean, it truly is breathtaking.
Absolutely. It's also tragic, and it's hugely expensive, which is why, as a result of the energy cost crisis, in all likelihood, we will have a financial disaster too. Remember that over the last 6 months, Europe has already spent 700 billion euros in handouts to households and businesses not to go under. So 700 billion, just think about what you could have done with that money in terms of energy infrastructure or energy generation, just handouts so that the industry doesn't go under and that households don't go under.
Repeat it, 700 billion in energy subsidies or energy handouts over the last 6 months?
Yeah.
Where did I haven't seen that figure. From where is that figure, Benny?
Read our newsletter today.
Okay.
It's an official figure.
That's just.
I mean, Britain itself has committed already 60 or 70 billion, and that's without the 30 billion for businesses. So we're talking hundreds of billions, and and Germany has committed 200 billion. Remember, just a week ago.
Right.
So add the 100 billion in Britain and 200 billion, and that's just Britain and Germany. And the others haven't been as generous because they know if you print too much money, your basically financial system is destroyed. And that's what we're facing. We're not only facing this ridiculous energy cost crisis, we're facing a financial crisis as well. Because what's the alternative? Look at this, when Liz Truss sacked her chancellor, right?
Yeah.
Quasi-supporting. We now have a new chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. The first thing he did was to kill what is called the energy package, which was a kind of 2-year unlimited guarantee to all households to make sure it was about somewhere between 100 and 200 billion pound guarantee to help households to heat their homes.
Right.
He killed that and said this will stop in April. You know what happens in April? Energy bills for the average household will go up to £5,000. That's 5 times more than energy bills were a year ago. 5 times. So most households won't be able to pay that. So the energy suppliers will go bankrupt because most households will struggle to pay that kind of money. And you asked, why did Labour table this fracking ban bill? Well,
right.
One of the reasons is it's almost certain that Labour will nationalize energy generation. So that is
30 years after 30 years after Thatcher. Goes backward, and in a privatization that began with Enron in the early 1990s with the Teesside power plant using natural gas from the North Sea, and now suddenly Britain is going to go back to the
To
old.
socialism. Yeah, we're going back to energy socialism. I have no doubt about that. Because the industry will not survive, as I said, given current price rises. It
Well,
won't
so
survive that.
so talk about that. What is the situation? Do you know? Do you have acquaintances, friends, people you know of who are closing their businesses? Give me the landscape. What is happening? Are you in London? I've forgotten. Where do you live?
I work in London.
You work in London. So what's What's the vibe there? Are businesses closing down? Are you seeing businesses shuttering?
Look, because of the 60 billion handout, right? I mean, energy prices have doubled essentially over the last 6 months. They
Uh-huh.
have doubled. Doubling is something which hurts, but you can survive. Trebling, quadrupling, or increasing by fivefold, you cannot survive. So this is why the government is handing out 60 billion to each individual household. That
Mm,
instead of your bill being £5,000, it's 2,500.
right.
30 billion are going to businesses, but once that money stops, most of these businesses will struggle to survive, particularly pubs, restaurants, small, medium-sized businesses. Never mind the little energy-intensive industry that still exists in Britain is simply not sustainable. It won't survive, and I very much doubt anyone is going to invest in any energy-intensive industry. Remember, I don't know whether you saw that story, but BMW, who was going to build the electric cars in Oxford, they announced last week that they're shifting their electric car production from Britain to, guess where? China. Right? So European companies are beginning already to announce a shift of their manufacturing from Europe to China. Obviously, China has cheap energy, cheap labor. What's not to like? The same with a gigafactory building batteries in the north of England. They have now delayed production and are struggling to, they need 200 million in investment. They're struggling to find that money. Who in their right mind would invest in a country where the energy cost is going through the roof? That's the reality. So tens of thousands of businesses, and that's what the kind of Association of Small and Medium-Sized Businesses has announced, tens of thousands of businesses are basically facing ruin.
But if I'm understanding you right, you're saying that the wave of closures hasn't really
Hasn't happened yet.
hasn't happened yet. So
No.
that for if I were to come to London today or to see
No,
other
you
parts
wouldn't
of
notice that.
it wouldn't be it wouldn't be that evident.
No.
But that's just forestalling what will be a series of disasters then next year then of
Well,
widespread closures.
that is you see, we published a paper telling MPs and ministers, you have only one option. If you want to make sure that this doesn't completely damage the economy, is you have to change policies to bring down the cost of energy.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing that because they are the net zero and the green agenda is their main priority. So they don't want to change policy. What they are doing, they have two options: either print more money and hand out more tens of billions to households and businesses so that they don't go under. That's the current policy. That will stop in April. Once that stops, you will see tens of thousands of businesses going bankrupt and households unable to pay their bills. So you see, this is the dilemma. You either bring down the cost of energy or everything goes belly up.
And the only way to do that is to increase supply, right? I mean, that's the only option, correct?
Well, that's one option, obviously.
Okay.
That's one option. That doesn't immediately reduce cost.
Okay.
But there are policies like the emissions trading scheme, the green subsidies, the kind of exports to the rest of Europe. There are a number of policies that you could radically change, which would bring down costs drastically and immediately. But it would mean that you have to pause net zero. And you have to say all these net zero plans we had, they have to be delayed. We can't do them right now. We live in an energy crisis. We can't go on business as usual. We have to make radical change. They are not willing to do that.
And they're not willing because they're still under this delusion of that Britain is going to save the climate. Or I mean, am I saying it correctly? How I mean, why are the resistance to shifting given the magnitude of the crisis?
Because they are told that gas and fossil fuels is the problem and renewables is the solution.
And so that's what they've been told, and they've believed it for all this time, and now there's no way they're going to change their mind on something they've been invested in for this long.
Yeah, they think that the you can, and as I said, Labour wants to do this in the next 8 years. They think the solution is renewable energy. That will solve the problem, and they seriously believe that.
Even though it's clear that you can't expand the wind and solar capacity in Britain enough to meet demand. I mean, there's just not enough land. You've already seen, as I observe it from here in the U.S., the backlash against wind and solar projects, the backlash against transmission projects is so fierce that the hope of building the amount of capacity needed, it's not going to happen. Am I misreading this?
No, well, you're not. But given that this is a matter of faith and belief and not a rational issue, it's difficult for any politician to acknowledge that they got it wrong for the last 20 years. So it's not going to happen. This generation of policymakers will not be able to turn this around, I'm afraid. They're not willing to acknowledge that the last 20 years caused this crisis, and they're not going to change. All I'm saying is there are solutions that you could introduce and remedies you could introduce which could reduce the overall cost of energy, but it would require radical reforms. And our current parties in Parliament are not willing to do that.
And the Labour bill on fracking is just the example. Would be the first example of this attachment to old ideas that have already proven to be wrong.
That's right. So therefore, I expect this to get much worse. As I said, I expect there are two. As I said, the current thinking is either you continue with the handouts, which will essentially ruin your economy and the credibility of the international markets in the economic stability of the country, because you're basically printing 100 billion per year. It's basically like furlough forever, right? It's even more. Furlough was, I think, 70 billion a year. Here we're talking 100 billion per year in handouts. Pure money.
And furlough, I'm sorry, forgive me, what was that?
That was the money that people got when they didn't go to work during COVID.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
And businesses would get the money just to shut down.
I see.
That was 70 billion a year, but now we're talking 100 billion per year.
That adds to that flood of cash that was already distributed during COVID.
That adds to a mountain of debt.
Right.
And as interest goes up, the government has to pay more and more in interest to pay off their debt.
So, Benny, I have to observe, I've done I don't know how many podcasts now, over 145 or 150, close to that. I pay attention a lot to the tone in their voices. And it's something in my personal relationships as well. As my dad used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I can hear, and we've talked before, and you came to Austin some months ago and we visited, and you came over and we traveled around Austin a bit. But I hear an edge in your voice and an anger and frustration that I haven't heard before. Is it anger and frustration of having seen this coming and not being listened to? Is it anger at the looming at the ongoing disaster? I'm asking. This is kind of a TV journalist question, I guess, but explain this. I mean, I hate to ask the question, "How do you feel?" But that's kind of where I'm going with this. Is it what? Explain that anger and frustration to me.
It's utter disillusionment with the political class And the realization that no matter what we say, no matter what the facts are, no matter even if there are potential solutions, there is no way out currently, because the political class is unwilling and unable to acknowledge that they got it wrong. So they will stick to their agenda no matter what, until it gets so bad that they will be kicked out left, right, and center, which is going to happen. And a new generation of politicians will arise who will realize that we can't go on like this.
So you're saying this is about pride then? I mean, ultimately, it's about this overbearing pride of these politicians to not admit their error.
It's not even pride. It's a psychological inability to, if you are almost religiously bound by a particular faith that what you've been doing, saving the planet, and going green and being on the right side of history and being virtuous and so on, if that is what drives you, it's very, very difficult to acknowledge we've made a mistake and we've caused the biggest economic crisis in European history since World War II. And remember, even after World War II, when Europe was destroyed, at least Europe still had energy in the ground. Mind you, Europe still has energy in the ground. I think we published a paper recently showing there's at least 300 years of coal still in Europe and at least 50 years of gas. So, if at one point politicians realize we have to start drilling, at least there's something left. But I am extremely concerned about the utter decline and degradation and relegation of Europe as a civilization as a result of which is yet another, in our long history, utopian pipe dream based on a millennial doomsday cult. That's what it is. They followed a doomsday cult almost to the ultimate disaster.
You said it very starkly, Benny, and I think that that's about right. That the doomsday cult brought about doomsday by their own prophecy, right, or their own misguided. It's interesting that your colleague John Constable and I talked about this, but I've talked with many other people about the inability of people just fundamentally don't understand energy, right? And so because they don't understand it, it's the perfect thing for demagogues, right? That demagogues can demagogue about it all day long because they don't know squat. And, we'll just change this and it's going to be fine. And wind and solar are good, so we need more wind and solar without any other discussion of the other impacts that has. And this seems to be, I'm only reflecting back to you what I've heard you say, because the policymakers only think about the policy. They don't think about the economics. They don't think about the technology. They don't think about the implementation or the land use or these other things that are part of that the policy affects. And now they're, as you say, they're not going to go backward because this is what it's a religious devotion to the policy that they've created without any understanding of what that means. And that's my read back to what you've said. Is that, am
Absolutely.
I coming close to this? But it's this, that there's, Richard Feynman said it, energy is very hard to understand. I mean, it's very subtle kind of thing that we're talking about. And yet there's endless politicization and demagoguery around it because very few get it.
Absolutely. That is true. And because it's a highly complex issue and most people don't get it, and most people are kind of wishful thinking about we could do it if the political will is there.
Right.
And okay, yes, wind and solar is intermittent, but we'll have the batteries and the storage. We just need to spend a few more trillion. We've heard this for the last 30, 40 years. And the evidence is quite obvious that you cannot run a country on renewables. You can't even run a single city on renewables. It doesn't. If that were possible, we would have an example. My good friend Francis Menton makes the case: if renewables would work, show me a single place on Earth where it works 24/7.
Right.
Doesn't exist. That's a very good indication that it will never exist.
So I just want to read the statement that you put out on Thursday, October 20th. This is from Net Zero Watch, and you can find more about Benny Peiser and his work at netzerowatch.com. You wrote, "The evident failure to embrace fracking is destroying the most promising chances of enhancing Britain's energy security while driving up energy costs. MPs, members of parliament, have been playing into the hands of Vladimir Putin as Britain will now be forced to rely more and more on costly gas imports rather than its massive shale resources. If the Westminster bubble think the current economic and political crisis is bad, they are in for a shock next year when energy bills go through the roof and businesses go under." I read that and I thought, okay, I need to talk to Benny again. And I'm glad we were able to connect. Today's October 22nd. So just the last couple of things, Benny, I told you I didn't want to go an hour. I just want to keep it fairly short because I want to put this podcast out early. What's next then? Truss is still in name as prime minister. How long would the process take to replace her? Is there any indication?
That will happen within a week.
Okay.
So by the next weekend, we should know if it is. My guess, it will be between Rishi Sunak, the former chancellor, and Boris Johnson. But if you ask me, it doesn't really matter, because no matter who is the next prime minister, in fact, no matter who's the next government, unless you tackle the energy cost crisis, no government will survive for long, because people can't live with these astronomical energy prices. They can't. No business and no household in the long term can survive on energy costs that are 5 times higher than they used to be. It's impossible. So that is the challenge. And the next prime minister will still be restrained by a conservative parliamentary party, which is deeply split between a green, woke, liberal wing, which is mainly social democratic, and a more conservative wing, many of whom also don't understand energy. So, I don't see a shortcut or any easy way out. My great concern is that it will get much, much, much worse before it gets better.
Well, let's leave it there. I usually ask, my last question is what gives you hope, but I want to not ask that question today. But Benny, I deeply appreciate your time. I know we're talking on a Saturday. It's morning here in Austin and afternoon in the UK. I appreciate you making time to talk with us again on the Power Hungry podcast. Again, my guest has been Benny Peiser, my friend Benny Peiser. He's the director of Net Zero Watch in the UK, a public charity. You can find more about their work, and I suggest you sign up for their newsletter. It comes out almost every day at netzerowatch.com. Benny, thanks again for coming on the Power Hungry podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm very, very sorry for all the bad news from Europe.
It's not your fault. All right, my friend, take care. We'll be in touch soon. Thanks to all of you in podcast land for tuning in to this edition of the Power Hungry podcast. Make sure and tune in next time. And if you have a chance, give us a good rating, 6, 12, 15 stars, whatever they allow you to do on those rating systems. And until next time, see ya.